So here's our sample that we're going to help try and dissolve. If you're having a bit of trouble, you can use a pipette to wash down the sides and agitate. If it still doesn't dissolve, you can add perhaps a little bit more solvent. And now we're ready to run. So similar to before, we want to make sure that our top of the column isn't disturbed, and so when we're loading our sample, we want to make sure that the sample does not disturb the top of the column by running it down the edge of the column. So just lightly pressing down on the pipette so that it runs down the column. And so you can see here I've got a rather thin band. As a comparison, I ran a second column earlier where I did a couple of incorrect techniques. You can see here that there's some bubbles formed in the column. That's because I added the solvent directly on top of the dry silica. You can see that the band is not straight. Perhaps I was a bit too rough when loading the sample. As well as that, my loading band is extremely large, and so that's going to hurt my separation when it runs through the column. Here I have a nice narrow band which should separate nicely. So I open my column, and like the solvent before, we run this down onto the column. Okay, you'll notice that I still have a little bit of sample down the column. I use my 25% ethyl acetate hexane mix to wash it down, gently down onto the column. Again, I don't want to create too much of a band whilst I'm loading my sample. Okay, this time I'm going to start preparing to run my column. Again, using the eluent of 25% ethyl acetate and hexane, I want to gently run it down the edge of my column as to not disturb the top of my column. And I'm going to keep doing this until I get about a 2 to 3 centimeter clearance off the top of my column. Like so. Next, I'm going to put my funnel back in and obtain some sand. What we're going to do now is create a buffer zone on the top of the column so that I don't disturb my column whilst I'm adding my solvent. So you want to lightly sprinkle the sand into the column. Doesn't matter that it sticks to the side, but enough to create, again, another 2 to 3 centimeter barrier, like so. I now have my barrier to protect my column, and then I can use my solvent to top up the column without having to worry about disturbing my column. Like so. Now I can start collecting my fractions using my test tubes and collecting from the column. And what we should hopefully see is these bands starting to resolve down the column. I'll apply pressure to the top to speed the process. So now you can see my yellow band is coming off the column, and my ferrocene has separated from my acetylferrocene. And at this point, I will stop my column because I've noticed that my solvent is getting close to the top, at which point I need to refill my solvent. You can't let any air bubbles appear in the column, otherwise, again, that's going to affect your separation. Over my column. And so now we continue on until my acetylferrocene elutes from the column. Okay, so I have finished running my column and I've aligned all the test tubes in order across 2 test tube racks. I put a bit of paper behind so you can better visualize the colors. But you can see here that my 4th fraction contains my ferrocene, and then as I move along, the 10th fraction to the 14th fraction contains my acetylferrocene. Now the only thing remaining is to pack up my column. So with any remaining solvent that you have left in the chromatography column, empty that into a waste flask and push through all the solvent that you can so that the silica dries out. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but at least so that the silica is no longer mobile. Next, we want to dispose of the rest of your solvent into the appropriate waste container, and then get another conical, an empty conical, and invert your column, leaving your tap open. Okay, ensure the column is slightly lowered into the conical flask so that the silica doesn't fly everywhere, and that you leave your tap open. This way, as the silica dries overnight, it'll collect in the flask below and can be emptied out into the silica waste.